Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
You know, for most of us, safe, reliable, and plentiful drinking water has always been a given. Recent droughts have taught us, however, that all the water we want and need may not be a given, at least no longer. With the unrelenting effects of climate change, we've already begun to see a change in the rules of the game when it comes to water. The question is whether we can act quickly enough to adapt to these disruptive changes that are already in motion and are likely to actually accelerate. Our guest is Ellen Hanak. She's one of the state's leading authorities on water and the director of the Water Policy Center at the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Great to be here. Hi, Mark.
So let's start with the basics, Ellen. On average, how much water do we have and how much water do we use?
Big numbers. California is a big state, and in a typical year, we use, I want to say, 38 to 40 million acre feet of water. And that is, an acre foot is a foot across an acre. So filling up basically a football field a foot deep, multiply that by about 40 million. A lot of that water is used in agriculture for irrigation. California has a very big agricultural sector, largest ag state in the nation. And then about a fifth of that water is used by communities, in cities and suburbs and small communities. And then of course, there's water for the ecosystem, which is on top of that.
Right, but the supply of water, does it match the demand for water in the state?
So, in a drought like we're in now, I would say definitely not. And you're seeing, in particular, growers are being severely cut back on their water deliveries, and urban communities also are facing cutbacks in surface water availability. They often have better plans in place. They have local storage and whatnot to kind of get through it. Yeah. And then smaller communities are starting to see wells go dry.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, climate change, it seems to have changed the calculus when it comes to water. How much has the climate change impacted California's water supply? And are we experiencing, is this going to become a new normal?
So, climate change is here when it comes to our water system, and the kind of really impactful way that you see this is in the rising temperatures and how that's changing snowpack, which our water system was built around the fact that we have these mountains in the Sierra that could typically, even in dry years, we would have some snow that would kind of serve as free seasonal storage, because it would arrive in the winter and early spring, and then it would slowly melt, just kind of get into the reservoirs just around the time when our irrigation and our summer sort of higher water demands started. And that was about a third of all the water used in a typical year was from the snowpack, and that is disappearing.
Now, what about wildfires? I mean, we're seeing these severe wildfires that are occurring as a result of climate change. What impact is that having on the supply of water?
So that is more a kind of a looming threat around water quality, I would say. Especially, there are debates about the role of the forests and kind of our headwater areas in terms of whether you can change the amount of supply by managing those forests differently. And there's probably some possibility for doing that, but the big threat is really on the water quality side.
So what about federal and state funding? You think it's adequately addressing the water storage needs in light of climate change? Are we getting enough funding to deal with that problem?
So we are getting way more funding from the federal government for water since the passage of the big infrastructure bill back in the late fall than we normally do. I've seen estimates suggesting, for safe drinking water in particular, that's going to increase resources from the federal government by, multiple fold for the next 5 years or so. The state also has, one of the sort of lucky things, given all that we've been dealing with in California and in the world with the pandemic and the recession and everything, the state is flush. And so they've been able to, for now, but both last year and it looks like this year as well, there's some extra money that's going to be available, and a lot of that's going to infrastructure, including in the water sector. So that's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, up next, we're going to talk about pumping water. That's always been seen as the fallback in times of drought. We're now finding that over-reliance on this fallback actually has a number of drawbacks. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. Underground water basins provide nearly 40% of the water used by California farms and cities. That significantly increases during drought years when farmers pump more groundwater to make up shortages from their surface water deliveries. As a result, there's been some damage to the aquifer. The question is, do we need a sustainable groundwater management approach to deal with that problem? Our guest is Ellen Hanak, a water policy expert with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California. First of all, what are the problems associated with groundwater overpumping?
There are a bunch of problems, and these have especially been evident in places like the San Joaquin Valley, where you are, Mark. So one of them is that it lowers the level of groundwater, and that causes wells to go dry. That we've seen a lot of the shallower wells, both drinking water wells, but also some ag wells going dry as a result of this. It also causes the ground to sink in some places, and we've seen, in the San Joaquin Valley, there are places where there's just been many feet of land sinking, and that causes all kinds of issues, including damage to roads, bridges, canals. So it even hurts the water system. And then there can also be impacts on water quality. There can be impacts to ecosystems, to rivers in certain places. So it's not a good thing.
Yeah, it's amazing that the ground actually sinks. And then they've had that along the canal, with the Fine Current Canal. They've had to repair it because it's actually collapsed. And so now they can't even convey the water. So as I've noted, groundwater use is really important to farmers, particularly during times of drought years. And we're experiencing a few of those right now, in fact. The question is the groundwater law that was set up by California, which says that these groundwater basins have to come into balance by 2040. Is it a situation of too little, too late? Do we need a faster approach to deal with the problems that are being caused by climate change?
Well, so there's been a lot of discussion about this lately because we are in the third year of a drought now, and that tends to increase the pressure to pump more water because there's less surface water available, and there's also less for replenishing. Less precipitation for replenishing the aquifers. So it's kind of accelerating the pressure on folks to implement. What I've said in policy circles, including in legislative testimony, is that my sense is that the law itself kind of already has what we need in terms of mechanisms for encouraging folks to get this right, because what it allows people 20 years to get to full sustainability, but it also kind of has some guardrails along the way so that you can't be causing significant undesirable results, like causing people's drinking water sources to dry up. So what you're seeing is basically an acceleration now of folks putting in place demand management, pumping restrictions, and so on.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, what should California do to prevent the groundwater situation from reaching a point of no return, though? I mean, the question is 2040 too long a timeline? And just as a footnote, it was amazing to me is California is behind Texas in this area. Texas was regulating groundwater well before California, so we're late to the party.
We are late to the party in terms of having a statewide rule and legislation about this, but arguably our law is more comprehensive and also really, is one of the few. I mean, Texas is like us in that way of really giving a lot of the responsibility to the locals to figure out what's going to work best at the local level. In California, there's a backstop, which is that if your plan is not gonna cut it, then the state can come in and require you to do some additional things. And there are a lot of the basins in the San Joaquin Valley right now that are in that position of having to kind of, send their plans back with some revisions by this summer in order to not have that happen.
Let me transition a little bit. It's a related issue. That's contaminated domestic wells, particularly in low-income communities. What can you tell us about the status of drinking water quality and affordability in California?
So, first I'll say most Californians have safe water coming out of the tap, the vast majority. But we do have, we have a lot of water systems. We have over 3,000, and there are, in any given month, there are a few hundred that are not meeting water quality standards. And those tend to be very, very small systems. We have, our small communities are often far flung and not connected to larger systems, and those are more expensive to manage in terms of addressing a water quality problem, because you don't have what we call economies of scale, where you can spread those costs of, say, water treatment across a lot of households. And those are also often low-income communities. So the combination of high costs per household and low incomes means that they really need help financially and often technically and managerially in solving this.
Right. They may not have the technical expertise to deal with it. We've only about 30 seconds left in this segment, but I want to ask you, what do you see as the priority steps to ensure safe and affordable drinking water for all Californians?
So I think, we're in a good place right now. There's been a lot of work to get legislation, to get funding in place, and we are now at a point where I would say funding is not the constraint. It's just the detailed technical work of getting these solutions in on the ground, and there are a lot of folks working on this.
Okay. Okay. Well, up next, what do water specialists? Why do they believe that nurturing and protecting California's ecosystems is essential to the state's water supply? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Kepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking with Ellen Hanak, who's a senior fellow and director of the non-partisan Public Policy Institute of California's Water Policy Center, about a recent report she co-authored on California's water priorities. So I want to turn our attention to this freshwater ecosystems that you have a whole chapter on in your report. Why is that important?
California is a biodiversity hub. We have, an incredible number of really, amazing species, fish, other aquatic species. We are a major part of the Pacific Flyway for waterfowl, terrestrial species, and our freshwater species are in big trouble because of changes to our water system. So it's important to think about that as part of managing water.
Is that kind of, I've heard them, the famous Delta smelt has been referred to kind of as the canary in the coal mines when it comes to water quality in the Delta. Is that a fair statement?
People in the Valley talk a lot about the Delta smelt because it's one of the fish that is kind of on that list, on the endangered species list. And so management of water in the Delta is partly done to try to mitigate harm to that species. But you've got salmon, you've got steelhead, there's not just one species. There's like a whole slew of them.
Right,
and,
right. That's become the poster, frankly, that's become the poster child for water issues. You always hear about the Delta smelt, and you're right that there's so many other species that are also being impacted. Let me ask you this. So what are you suggesting the state do to maintain the natural infrastructure in light of climate change?
So, we've been trying to do a lot in California to kind of restore the health of our native and freshwater species, really since, I would say, especially since the early 90s. And part of that is, making more water available at certain times. Part of it is, restricting how other folks use water. Part of it is restoration, but we haven't been doing enough fast enough. And what we're suggesting is really kind of a shift in approach toward thinking about the ecosystem as a whole rather than managing for specific species, looking for ecosystem health and what a concept called functional flows. Where
I was going to ask you about that because could you explain that?
Yeah, so the idea is that you're not going to restore the fully pre-development ecosystem. We change things radically, but what you can do is kind of make water available, kind of mimicking the patterns of the natural stream flow, and making more water available, pulse flows in the spring to kind of help the salmon move. Certain times of the year you want to have make sure you're having the right temperatures in the water and so on, but really thinking about this in a strategic way rather than kind of a minimum flow approach, more of a flexible management to make the water most useful.
Well, let me ask you about another term that I saw in your report, and that was headwater forests. I'm sure there's a simple explanation, but what are they and why are they important to California's water supply?
So headwater forests, California is a big forest state, and as we all know, our the Sierra Nevada, the Cascades to the north, big mountains with a lot of trees, and those are also the places that are the headwaters, the origin of a lot of our water. That's where a lot of our rivers start, and that's the source of a lot of our water supply. And those forests have gotten very unhealthy over decades. We've had a fire suppression policy in place for a long, long time, which has meant that those trees have gotten, the forests are very dense now, and they're kind of tinderboxes now, especially with the rising temperatures. So we've all seen and experienced the wildfires, terrible wildfires that we've had in the past decade, in recent years. And that's not good for our water. That's not good for water quality in the system. It's obviously not good for air quality. And we've got to do something to get those forests back into healthier shape.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you're talking about is better stewardship, right? I mean, the plan had always been fire suppression, but now they're realizing, well, maybe controlled burns make more sense. And you also talk in your report about providing some support for infrastructure, for like sawmills and biomass, and train people to woodworking, using wood, all the kinds of things that kind of address the health of our forests.
Correct, because you want to be able to do this in a way that also brings some value to the communities that live in these areas, right?
Right,
so
right.
creating jobs, as well as finding ways to kind of get those forests to be thinner and use some of that wood productively.
Okay, well, up next, how do we ensure that California is actually climate ready? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Hepler with the Maddy Institute. We're talking about the state's water priorities with Ellen Hanak, who is a water policy expert with the Non-Partisan Public Policy Institute of California. Your report makes it clear that you believe you believe we have to think differently about how we manage the risk posed by climate change when it comes to water. And you've written that, quote, we've passed a climate inflection point, unquote, and we need to move from planning for climate change to actually taking action for the impacts that are already occurring. One suggestion you have is for the state to become more climate ready is to improve water storage and conveyance. What specifically are you suggesting?
So the key thing is recognizing that a major part of our storage, which is snowpack, is disappearing. And so we've got to find ways to make up for that. And thinking about that is really both, looking at where the smart plays are in terms of increasing surface storage, but there aren't going to be a lot of those because we built it in already in most of the good places. So it's especially leveraging the capacity we've got in our underground aquifers to get more water in there, and then have the conveyance that can move the water between the surface and the groundwater basins so that we can really optimize that as a system.
Yeah, I mean, you hear a lot about sites, reservoir and temperance flat. But the question I think for me is, what's the most cost-effective way to capture the water that we do have? And it seems like underground storage is a pretty cost-effective way to do that. From a non-water expert, as an outsider, what about updating water infrastructure? And I guess that would in term canals and whatnot, and using technology as a way to improve the efficiency and effectiveness is how we use water in California.
Right. So, technology is going to be really helpful to us, and there have been some major advances, and we're already kind of, taking some steps in that direction, and proof of concept shows we can do more on this. One of them is something called Forecast Informed Reservoir Operations, FIRO, and that is where using kind of advanced weather forecasting about 10 days out, you can determine is a big storm likely to hit your reservoir or not. If it's not likely to hit, you don't necessarily have to release that water in anticipation of that storm. And that allows you to manage flood risk at the same time keeping some of that valuable water in the reservoir. So that's going to be a big one.
Yeah, there's also the issue of just repairing conveyances. We talked earlier about the Fine Kern Canal, that it's sinking because of subsidence, and they're losing that. It's not as efficient in moving the water, so we've got to repair the infrastructure as well.
Yeah, and luckily that one is underway now. The ground has been broken, funding was kind of cobbled together to do that. So, but there are some other places where we're going to have to also do some fixes on conveyance, and there's probably some new conveyance that's going to be important. We think that probably up, something like down in Kern, there's something called the Cross Valley Canal that connects the east and the west side. Something further north in the valley would also be useful like that.
Okay. One of the key points in your report was that, quote, we cannot simply build our way out of water scarcity. In short, reducing the demand of water is essential. And this becomes kind of a third rail when it comes to water. You say that inevitably means following farmland. So how do you ensure that won't devastate the valley farm economies?
No, and this is a hard one. And I would say even if the climate weren't changing, there would be a need to do that because we've been mining our groundwater basins, and just to kind of have to have water for the long term and to keep our groundwater basins healthy for the long term, we would need to be managing demand. We estimate that in the San Joaquin Valley, somewhere between 10 and 20% of the irrigated acreage is going to have to come out of intensive irrigation. There are ways to manage that that won't devastate the economy, but that's going to require some coordinated action and effort to, put other good things on that land, basically.
Well, yeah, I've heard that if the number is anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million acres of land potentially being fallow. Let me ask you, all of this is going to cost money. Where's the money going to come from?
Well, a lucky thing is that right now we've got the ability to make some down payment on this with some extra state funding that's available. The state's budget has been flush over the last couple of years, and they're definitely putting money into water infrastructure. The federal government has provided a boost of funding, but that's a down payment. So we're going to have to be thinking about ways to bring in additional federal and state money, and also smart ways for water users to also contribute to this. And that's why picking the most cost-effective solutions really makes sense. You want those dollars to go as far as they can.
Well, one of the things I found in your report I thought was really great, a good summary, and it was, we need to take risks to reduce risks. And I think that really does summarize the situation. I want to thank our guest, Ellen Hanak, the director of the Water Policy Center at the Nonpartisan Public Policy Institute of California. If you want to stay current on state and local politics, you can sign up for our daily e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by just logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity.